All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, Jeff.
Hello.
Um, we are having a conversation this morning, specifically looking at um, racism towards Asian and Asian Americans in America today. And I've invited Jeff to have this conversation because he's thoughtful. He has a lot of education around these things. And also for us, since I'm a part of Knox Church, he has come and been an integral part of Knox. So, Jeff, can you just introduce yourself a little bit, what you're doing now, some of your history and connection to Knox even?
Sure. Yeah. So I was in Ann Arbor from 1997 through 2007, and I started attending Knox when I was a junior in college. My the woman who's now my wife, her name is Lisa. She took me to Knox, and we became members later. I was a InterVarsity Christian Fellowship staff member from the time I graduated in 2001 to the time we left Ann Arbor in 2007. And I left staff in 2007, but I actually recently just came back to staff in 2019. So 12 years later, I came back to staff. I'm now the director of theological formation for InterVarsity USA, and working on training and developing staff in their theology, especially as it pertains to ministry in the university. Knox was the first church that I was a member at, and where I was mentored by folks that I know are still there. I wish I could see your faces. I learned about the covenant of grace. I learned about so many things that now serve me and have formed me theologically and inform what I do within the varsity. So that's my connection to Knox. I'm grateful.
That's good. That's good. I know a lot of people still remember you and are grateful for you. Um, as we said earlier, thinking about Asian and Asian American racism in America today, would you kind of just start us off by just kind of thinking about and sharing some of your thoughts about like what you're seeing today in the world, and how that's impacting you and impacting our world?
Sure. Yeah. So racism as it pertains to Asian Americans is really different than I think a lot of the ways we talk about race and racism around the kitchen table. So there's some really important distinctions that I think I personally would want to drive home with your audience, with the Knox family.
Yeah.
I think many times, especially because of the way race is portrayed in the media and the way it's depicted in movies, we think in terms of black and white. Uh, that is the historic kind of race conflict that informs the way we think about race in the first place. We think you have these two poles in the United States, and in between you have white and black, right? And I'll just give you an example. I was talking with some folks at a Christian camp, and I was talking about, culture, race, and ethnicity. And I was talking about how, since I'm not white, and the person I was talking to, who is black, said, "Wait a minute, what do you mean you're not white? You're white." And I said, "Excuse me, that's not," in my mind, I'm like, that's not true. That's not precise. But
Yeah.
when you flatten the conversation and all there exists are these two poles, then everybody's got to fit into one or both categories, one or either categories, right? And that's a way of erasing entire people groups from the conversation who have their own experience. So this is one of the points that I want to drive home. Asian Americans have their own experience of being minorities or non-whites or non-blacks in the United States. And one of my colleagues talks about different factors that contribute to the experience of Asian Americans in the United States. One of them is migration. The way that we came to this country, whether as refugees or immigrants, what kind of visa we had, these things are unique to the Asian American community. One way is how we're perceived because of our physical features.
Hmm.
There really is no unifying physical feature, right? Like just because I have dark hair doesn't mean that I'm Asian American, right? Lots of people have dark hair, but take it even further. Like I have a certain skin tone, but folks from India who are considered Asian American according to the US Census, they look different. In fact, different enough to be confused with Middle Easterners after 9/11 and to
Yeah.
be the targets of discrimination and racism at that time. So there's no unifying physical features. So our experience of race, um, when we say Asian American, a lot of folks have something in mind immediately, and it doesn't encompass all of us. That can be an advantage for some, a disadvantage for others. That's part of the experience. Yes, there's a lot of different features for what it means to be Asian American in the country right now. But there's also, we have a unique history in this country, and it's worth kind of running through it really briefly. You can ask questions about this, but I'll just give you 4 examples, right? So in the late 1800s, it was the policy of the United States, the national policy, to discriminate against Asian Americans on the basis of race. In 1882, Congress passed and the president signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, where people from China or people of Asian descent were not permitted to immigrate to the United States. And a slew of legislation related to that about land ownership, about citizenship, et cetera, followed. You will recall before the United States entered World War II, during World War II, Japanese Americans, many of whom had been living in the country for generations, were interned in camps and suspected of being or feared for being a part of the Japanese war effort. In the 1980s, when the auto industry was going through one of its doldrums or one of its depressed moments, Asian Americans were scapegoated, and in Detroit, not too far from Knox, a young man named Vincent Chin was confronted by 2 auto workers outside of a bar, and he was bludgeoned and murdered. His assailants received a slap on the wrist and were released, essentially released. They did not. Justice wasn't seen in that incident. So these things are kind of in many of our minds, that we are perceived as foreigners no matter what, that we couldn't possibly be Americans. We don't look American because we don't look white, we don't look black, so we're not American. And when you're not American, you can be a threat, like right now, because the pandemic is perceived to have a foreign origin, and we appear foreign, and we might therefore be carriers of the COVID, the coronavirus. Then we become targets of racism and discrimination.
Yeah,
that's really tough for us. There's other features as well. We talk about.
I mean, we've so we talked about. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your story, but even just knowing that there are folks in our community in Ann Arbor, in our own community at Knox, where they themselves have had, have felt aggressions towards them because of being Asian American, and having people make comments like, go back to your country, or I mean, as you're even reading in the news, more and more of just these physical attacks against people.
Right.
And so I'm just curious on even your own story, growing up into now, what's it been like for you?
Yeah, it's been pretty wild. So I grew up in Oklahoma, and you would think that in a place with the demographic stats like rural Oklahoma, that I'd have a lot of stories to tell. But the way that I describe it is this: the further I get from Oklahoma, the more acts of aggression I've experienced. So in Oklahoma, it was typical playground stuff, people making fun of physical features, people chanting little kind of nursery rhyme style racist chants at me, which at the time I didn't know was bad, because when you're a kid, it's like, oh, this is kind of a sing-songy chant and
Yeah.
kind of has an innocuous feel to it, but really they were stereotyping and calling out physical features and kind of creating for themselves like this person is racially different. So that's the schoolyard experience for so many of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Then, I moved to the Midwest and I come to Michigan for college, and I begin to have more significant conversations with people. And that's really where you begin to get into it. The more vulnerable people open up and have like conversations that are real and kind of let their actual thoughts out, you begin to realize, oh, wow, they have not only nurtured that sing-songy nursery rhyme, but they've really developed a worldview around people who are different from them. And I began to experience relational rifts. When I would say that being Asian American was important to me, especially Christians would kind of freak out a little bit and say, well, wait a minute, the gospel is not about any of these things. The gospel is about your individual soul. It's about you and Jesus. And one of the things that I'm grateful I learned at Knox was this whole me and Jesus thing. That this is like the tiniest part of the gospel. And
Yeah.
there's so much more. And I'm so glad for the teaching that Knox does to kind of dispel that. But people still were holding on to like the gospel and the Bible has nothing to do with race. And I think it was Bob who said to me, Pastor Bob, said, once you see it in the book of Galatians, you really can't unsee it. And that's been true for me in biblical studies and theological scholarship. But, the further I got, I went to LA later. Man, the first time, excuse me, I went to the DMV, there was a person just yelling in the DMV at the Asian Americans.
In LA?
In LA.
Okay.
Yeah. So people think Los Angeles is this, metropolitan, cosmopolitan, diverse place where people got it figured out. I got to tell you, the well-intended folks in the Midwest and Midwest nice, man, that goes a long way. People would ask me questions in the Midwest, but here in LA, they assume they know because they've grown up in a diverse place. But really, they still live insulated lives and don't truly understand their neighbor. So they don't really love their neighbor. It's really tough. So I've experienced more incidents of the worst kinds of out and out explicit racism here in Los Angeles than I even than I did in the Midwest. And in Oklahoma, it was fairly low level at when I was growing up. So that's been my experience.
Yeah. We had talked about like even thinking about this is so much more in our culture. And as I even talked to young folks, even compared to when I was growing up, and you are similar age, where there's a much more heightened reality of racism in America today. But I think as you and I both talked about, but there seems to be a difficulty in figuring out how do we though engage it? How do we though individually care for folks? How do we corporately, even as churches, start to move and even think about these things? So I guess what advice would you give to individuals? What advice would you give to churches, to communities to say, how do we start caring and taking first steps or even further steps forward and engaging this well? Because we don't want to do harm, and we don't want to ignore the question, but we want to move well on this.
Sure. Yeah. So many thoughts here, Josh. The first step is really to understand the nature of the problem, the nature and the scope of the problem. So, just like with many social issues in the United States, there's different perspectives that all need to be understood, different experiences. So, for example, when we say race has been treated as black and white, if we want to get it right, we're going to have to understand race from the Asian American perspective, right? So that's going to require some learning for your folks. So, for example, it's important to know that in the latter half of the month of March, since the COVID-19 reporting has been coming out and statements from this administration, 1,000 cases of anti-Asian racism have been reported. 1,000 cases. one of my colleagues, Russell Jung, who's a sociologist and ethnic studies professor at San Jose State, has been collecting, is part of an effort to collect reports. So you don't see them in the news. You're not going to learn about them in school. If you learn about them in church, I would be really surprised. But here we are talking about it.
And those are ones that have only been reported.
Right.
Correct.
Right. And the Asian American inclination to report things that happen to us is very low. So it's a safe bet that there's a lot more than that. So we're at about 100 per day in the country. Some of these are violent physical attacks. A family was slashed and stabbed at a Sam's Club in Texas. Children were injured in that stabbing. It's horrific. So it's important to acknowledge the nature and the scope of the problem. People can tend to think that Asian Americans, well, they're highly educated, they're financially successful. This is all part of a myth about Asian Americans in our country, that all of us, because there's a perception of what we look like and what we achieve in this country, that we therefore experience relatively few problems. That myth is incredibly harmful. It causes us to forget what's actually really going on and to turn a blind eye, thinking that whatever's being reported is anomalous. This is not really the case. So the first step is to acknowledge the scope and the nature of the problem. And I'm grateful for my colleagues who are producing hard data to kind of help us understand the nature of the whole thing. So that's step one.
Yeah.
I think when we see these kinds of problems, we can tend to feel very rushed to fix them. But as you alluded, that can really be a problem. Without the kind of credibility and the historic consistency on issues of race, to jump in and to on a horse, like a rescuing horse, you can be met with some skepticism. Why are you here? What are you doing? What are your intentions? Do you have any understanding of the nature and scope of the problem? Have you practiced any of the real solutions? So, I think what I'm trying to say is, here at the early stages of a person's desire to be a helpful influence on the problem is to spend the time educating yourself. And there's at least a few things to educate yourself with. Number one, to become acquainted with the pain of people who suffer, that takes time. You don't really fully palpate or understand or empathize with someone's pain until you've sat with them for a while, listening to their stories. In other words, if you haven't listened personally to some stories of pain and suffering, you're not ready to jump in yet. As tempting as it is to be a force for good, you got to sit with folks. You don't know when you're having been a pastor now for a number of years. When you're at a hospital bedside, you don't just jump in and fix things, because you can't. You sit there in the pain as a chaplain to suffering, and that's a key first step. There's other forms of education too. There's documentaries to watch. There's films that depict our experience in the United States. There's conversations to be had. There's books to be read. There's so many things that people can do if you have the will to do them. And I think one thing that can be helpful is for church leaders to intentionally pursue that kind of education for their congregations. And I'm grateful that you've asked me to be a part of that.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've seen you do, and just even on Instagram or other things, and you were showing me before we were having this conversation about, this website and this, kind of so-called movement or whatever that you guys are starting to try and really help identify what is taking place and the racism in America today, is identifying it and not letting it just slip by. Where I think I know I've even seen in myself where it's not stepping in and saying that's not actually okay to say that. And I've been encouraged and been challenged even by your own publicness of doing that, of identifying that's not an okay comment to make. Like, that is a racist comment, and calling a spade, and even doing that little step.
Yeah. That's a huge challenge for a lot of folks. I think, the R word, racism or racist, we have a lot of thoughts about that. We have a lot of thoughts about what comprises racism and what doesn't. There's a lot of ideology involved, and people are coming from different angles.
Hmm.
And, I'm one of the first people that wants to acknowledge that people have different views on what racism and racist is. They follow some pretty predictable lines in terms of political and philosophical ideology, even theology, some very predictable lines. And that's a lot of what I've studied. But if I could reduce it to something that I think is just human and hopefully really easy to get on board with. Words can injure. Little jokes can injure. And telling somebody, hey, you need to lighten up because this is actually really funny to me. I don't understand why it's not funny to you.
Yeah.
That, I think if we want to care for people the way that Jesus cared for people, we take into grave consideration how words impact people.
Yeah.
If I tell you that these words injure me, and you say you need to lighten up because it's actually really funny, we will have a rift, a really serious rift that I think does something to the fabric of the body of Christ that doesn't honor Jesus.
Yeah.
What I would prefer is that you would sit in and listen to how I experienced that joke, and that you would take my experience seriously, because I'm just like you. I'm a rational person. I have thoughts and I have feelings, and these things matter, and they affect us on a practical level. They affect us. So it's wishful thinking to say that I should find humorous what you find humorous.
Yeah. We talked about even this kind of transitioning us into thinking about, okay, ways that we can care for people, but even just finding our own self-evaluation of how might I be perpetuating some of this problem. And you're kind of touching on some of those things right now of, can I step back? Can I be self-aware and seeing that, wait, why am I saying lighten up? Or why am I thinking this? Or why am I in different settings using certain language or a certain posture? And so one of the things I've even had to do in thinking about different things, kind of growing up, as you said, in Oklahoma, I grew up in a very rural town. And so it was not a very diverse setting in any means. And so realizing, even on my own end, and many times I was the one saying some of those like things to someone else when I was younger, or even things about the LGBTQ community. And honestly, having to come and repent eventually about some of those things, and being honest, like, yeah, this was where I had wronged. And for me, it came into being in, like you said early on, being in closer relationship and having friends and hearing where their hearts are and what's going on, and being like, man, I've got to learn a lot, and actually be honest about where I have done wrong and sinned, and knowing that doesn't mean I've been defined by that, but that God then helps me move forward in new ways, and honoring different people. So I'm just wondering too, how might we even be thinking about how we self-examine or put ourselves and thinking about these things, and how we might look at ourselves.
Right. Yeah, well, there's a couple experiences that I think informed me on this. When I got to LA, I started working for a church that is quite diverse. I would say it was between 30 and 40% non-white, which is well above the national average. I think a diverse church is considered 20% non-white, or non-one racial ethnic group. So there were a lot of conversations to be had. And the church at the time was just at the very beginning of talking about issues of culture, race, and ethnicity. And only a couple years in, I think some informal surveying was done, and a lot of folks were saying, we talk about race too much. So I raised that example because the kind of introspection that I would encourage people to engage in is, what is your kind of energy level for this? What is your motivation? Does this kind of exasperate you as we begin? As you listen to this conversation, you find yourself exasperated, and bring that to the Lord and ask the Lord, why is that? When God loves the nations, why is it exasperating for me to talk about the nations? Because if I'm a missional person, if I care about God's mission to reach people from every pen, then why is it so exasperating for me to talk about race? Because there are people groups here in the United States that, are worth reaching.
Yeah.
That's the beginning of the introspection. Then secondly, to know that you can cultivate greater energy and motivation for this kind of cross-cultural, cross-ethnic, cross-racial ministry that we've been called to as a family. There is actually a tool that can be used to assess your energy level, your motivation, your skill. It's called cultural intelligence, and I personally use it to coach folks in thinking about their effectiveness in cross-cultural situations. One of the features of that, which you can kind of distill for your own use, is you can ask folks to rate your competency and energy level for reaching out across culture. And sometimes we think we're great. Man, all the jokes that I make, they're funny and everybody loves them. But man, if somebody doesn't think that that's funny at all, their feedback could be really important for your self-perception.
Yeah.
Getting critical feedback from cultural insiders is one way to learn about your own positioning in the world, your own the perception that people have about you.
Yeah.
One caveat there is, to get meaningful feedback means that there's a lot of trust, and that a person who's giving you the feedback has got the energy to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
If you're an exasperating person, it's hard for me to poke that hornet's nest and tell you something that's difficult. So your own openness to receiving feedback, demonstrating that over the course of years that you care about what people, about the feedback that people give to you. That's cultivated over years, and that's something that you can begin today.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful to even hear, here are some steps to be doing, thinking about self-examination and making steps, but also, like you said, that some of these things take a while, that it's not going to be a quick fix by any means.
Right.
But it is saying why we're even having this conversation, that it is a conversation that needs to be had more. And it is something to continue to bring to light, to say, how do we right wrongs, and how do we engage in these things well. And we could talk a lot more. And I know as you and I've had conversations, you've got so many things to say and so many really good things to say. And I've been blessed immensely by them. And I really hope that our people at Knox will, or anyone else who hears this conversation. And so, I think even maybe underneath this video, I might have you send us some different links to resources,
Sure.
Articles or books that people can check out if they want to find more information about this. But I'm just really grateful for you, Jeff, and your work and what you're doing, and for this conversation.
Yeah,
So,
well, thanks to you, Josh, and thanks to Knox for taking a minute to listen. And, I'll be praying for all of you. Happy to send resources your way, and hope to visit you, anytime that I can. We try to worship with y'all. So
yeah, you and I, we can go back to Comet Coffee and get our coffee.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again. And so we will talk later.
Okay, great.